Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest, Leah Gipson, who's going to talk to us about art therapy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Leah, why don't we start out by talking about what we mean by therapy here. I understand we're not just talking about therapy for people with mental illness, right? It's a broader definition.
Right, so I think oftentimes people might think that therapy is something that you do if something terrible has happened, and certainly therapy can be helpful if you have experienced some kind of crisis, but also therapy is just helpful for people to have a space where they can go and process what's happening in their lives, changes that are happening, and move through those changes consciously in dialogue with someone else.
Yeah, so what sort of people, give us some examples of some people you've worked with here regarding art therapy.
So I work primarily with women and girls. I've worked with women and girls who've experienced sexual violence. I've worked with people who have struggled with addiction. I've worked with folks who are dealing with housing instability. My particular background, I think, really focuses on thinking about the ways that our society really impacts what people then come to therapy for, and how people are able to navigate the obstacles that they are facing given the resources that may or may not be available in the world.
Mm-hmm. And when we say art therapy, what kinds of art are we referring to?
So my background is in art therapy, which is one of the creative arts therapies. So there's different forms of creative practices that you can use in therapy: drama, music, dance, or the combination of those art forms, and expressive arts therapy. So I am primarily working with visual art oftentimes, but of course I don't limit my practice to just visual art if people are coming to me with certain ideas about poetry or music. Generally, it's just the encouragement to integrate creative thinking and creative practices when you're in therapy with someone.
So what would this be like if I came to see you? Would I bring my portfolio with me? How do we do this?
Well, if that's something that you wanted to do, I would certainly encourage you to do that. I mean, I've asked, if I've worked with youth before, I've asked them to bring their Instagram, if they're posting things on Instagram, just to kind of see what kind of photos they like to take. So I might ask you, do you have anything that you do, creatively, and what you wanted to share with me as a place to start.
Right.
And then I might ask you to do something that maybe was out of your comfort zone, just to kind of us to get to know each other a little bit and to sort of figure out what kinds of things we might try together as a part of the work that we do in therapy.
So do something like draw, or? If
you were comfortable with drawing, we could do drawing, absolutely. Yeah. I think drawing is maybe a hard one for a lot of people if you're not coming in feeling really confident, but I certainly can help if there are skills that people want to learn in therapy.
So it could be photography then?
It could absolutely be photography.
Interesting. I feel like I want to do this, but maybe not on TV. I think I'll
yeah, well, that would break confidentiality, so you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, it might. So can you describe, anonymously some situations where somebody produced something and you had insights because of it?
I think that happens all the time. I guess I can think of times when I might have given a simple direction, asking people maybe to do a self-portrait, for example, and to just kind of see the way that people imagine themselves in a space where they maybe feel comfortable to talk about how they see themselves in relation to the people in their lives. So I think it's oftentimes when people have the space to really think about how they might represent their own image that really beautiful insights come about, because people aren't often given that space, right, to just sort of create that reflection of themselves and share it with others.
Yeah, it would be an interesting exercise for everybody to try to do a self-portrait of themselves in some way, right? I remember I was doing a magazine article and they wanted a picture to go with it, and I spent like half a day trying to get the right picture. So I think even with photography, we give a lot of thought to what we're wearing and what's around us, so there's a lot to be interpreted there. But I was wondering if you could just think of one example to talk about here, just to make this a little more tangible.
I worked with a young client who was struggling with self-harm.
Okay.
And she really actually liked to draw. And so that's one of the practices that we used regularly, was to check in with a drawing. So we did these kind of snapshots of her day. So she would kind of do a quick drawing when we first started of her day, and that would be sort of a jumping off point for us to kind of, why did you choose to draw this particular moment in your day? And it was just a way for us to just sort of be grounded in a ritual, a routine each time we met. And she, began to sort of look forward to being able to share maybe something that happened in her day or in her week when she came to therapy.
Yeah, I imagine as this progresses and people understand it better and they get better at what they're doing, that gets more and more revealing and useful.
I definitely think so. I think that what happens when people become more comfortable with the process of therapy and comfortable with checking in and being able to go back and forth in the therapy space and in their own lives, it becomes useful.
Yeah. Do you find that most people have positive associations with creating art, that it creates an atmosphere that's more conducive to open conversation?
It can be. It depends on the experiences, the cultural experiences people have had with art making, right? Because you know that some people have had experiences with art teachers maybe that weren't great, or they've had experience of being judged. Sometimes making art can bring out things that people are feeling about being judged, but we can use the art to really work through maybe larger global things people might be experiencing around other people's gaze, right, or that judgment, right, of being in spaces where you may not feel like you can be yourself, or you're not being allowed to.
So you've been doing this a while. Have you ever had someone discover that they really had some serious artistic talent and follow up on that?
Discovery, maybe so. I think sometimes people do surprise themselves, and when they kind of let themselves get into it, or they might say, oh, I haven't done this in a really long time, and people decide that they want to continue to make art beyond the therapy session.
Yeah. So if I were walking through a museum with you and we were looking at a Picasso or a Salvador Dali, would you have insights that maybe other people wouldn't have?
I don't think so.
No?
No, I don't think so.
I know that, some artists like the surrealists were actually trying to tap into their subconscious with what they were doing. And Picasso said many times that he was trying to relearn how to draw like a child. It seems to me that they were using their art in a sense to kind of get back into who they were, just as you're describing using it for therapeutic reasons. Do you?
Absolutely, I think a lot of artists have done that, and certainly the field of art therapy grows out of a place where people understand that making art is one of the ways in which we can understand the world, understand ourselves.
Yeah, and art therapy has been around for a while, I understand.
It has been around for a while. I mean, making art in therapy is as old as psychoanalysis, so it's not necessarily unique to the profession of art therapy. Many social workers, counselors use art in therapy. Art therapists really focus on really thinking about what it means to use art in therapy, not only as something that's something that you can offer, but something maybe to encourage people to explore.
Now, I know you've published some articles and you have a book chapter that deal with these issues, and you refer to the reconceptualization of art therapy. What do you have in mind?
Well, what I'm trying to do is really think about art therapy as a cultural practice, and I want to locate the field of art therapy in the social histories where it emerges. So I am thinking about art therapy in the United States, and I'm thinking about Black women, who I name in this chapter as founders of the profession, which is not often how Black women from the 70s in the field have been described as founders. Oftentimes they think Black art therapists have been tokenized, sort of named as, these are people who exist, here's the diversity in our field, without really deeply engaging with the ideas that Black art therapists have brought to the field. So this chapter is really looking at Black women's political consciousness as a way to really understand, well, what could art therapy be if it came from this place of understanding how art and therapy respond to a social world.
Well, take us a little deeper into that then. So what's the difference there?
So I look at three Black women art therapists from the 1970s, or I look at them in that period, Lucille Venture, Georgette Seabrook Powell, and Sarah McGee. And I think one of the things that's really unique about the way that they're thinking, Georgette Seabrook Powell and Lucille Venture are talking about art therapy and the third world. They're thinking about internationalism. They're thinking about this political connectedness of people around the world who are oppressed. And that if you're trying to practice therapy and you're trying to help people move through the problems that they're facing in their lives, you have to think about the world where those problems stem from. So Sarah McGee, for example, is working with traditional African spirituality and integrating that into her practice. And Georgette Seabrook Powell really comes out of a political way of working in community murals, and thinking about how building community is not only this, the individual needs to change, right? But an individual is a part of a community that can work together to realize those changes. And Lucille Venture is working in schools. It comes to art therapy as an art educator and really thinks about how racism is impacting the children that she's working with.
Well, let's take a community mural for an example. How do you deal with that then if you're approaching it like this? Do you see it as representing somehow the consciousness of the community as well, or?
I think so. I think that's one way. I think you ask people to think about public space and think about representation, how they want to be seen. You think also about place. Where is this mural? What does it mean for people in this particular space and community to have their voice or their image represented, to sort of be in dialogue with the kinds of problems that are there and with the imagining the solutions that might be there also.
Yeah. Are there any community murals that you can mention that might be examples?
Well, Cliff Joseph, who I don't actually focus on in this book chapter, but Cliff Joseph does have a book that he talks about murals of the mind, and so his work is really rooted in, at that time, was really rooted in that kind of public mural work, also with people who were in psychiatric treatment. I think that's just one example. The practice is really about, and sort of thinking through the practices I'm referring to, is really about that back and forth between that social world and the public, and that individual world and the private.
This research you're doing and the research that others are doing in this, where is it leading us then? Is this?
Well, I'd like to do more work to kind of dig deeper into the practices of the three women that I'm talking about in this chapter, because what I do is more of a bird's eye view in this chapter, and I also talk about sort of the legacy of their work and how it has shaped the profession at certain points in time, but what does it mean to continue to engage their ideas further and to really center Black women's intellectual labor and creativity in what we think of as art therapy. And so I think the next steps, or the ways that I think this archival work is really about envisioning a profession in which people see themselves as needing to change things about society, not only asking people to individually carry the burden of things they might be dealing with, but changing the way systems really respond to those barriers and inequalities that people are naming, especially in this moment, given the pandemic, given the attention now to structural racism, right, to gender inequities. And I think that when we see our role as professionals, not only in this one-on-one space of individual counseling, but in this larger landscape of political activism in this moment, I think that our practices have to look different.
Yeah. Well, and so you're obviously practicing in this field. What changes have you seen during the pandemic? What's your point of view on this?
Well, I think a lot of what I would have done has become virtual, like everything else. And so our therapists are having to navigate what it means to make art in a completely different room on the other side of a camera from the person that you're working with. But I also think that there are, ways in which art therapists are using this moment to rethink what the profession is and what the profession can be, whether that is who can share space together, right? Because we can be in different, not only just a different physical space, but we can be in different states, we can be in different countries. And so one of the things about this book chapter is, again, not only focusing on simply difference in a superficial way, but what those differences have to offer in terms of the traditions and histories and ideas, and really deeply engaging with the cultures that can shape our practices.
But what about just in the work that people are producing, the people you're working with? Have you seen the impact of the virus on what they're expressing through their own art? I understand they're more isolated now, and so that may impact their ability to focus a little bit more, some things like that, right? But,
well, I think the pandemic is really highlighting how deeply our society has ignored problems of racial injustice. And people are making serious work about that. People are seeing themselves as a part of a moment in which there's a cultural awakening, and there needs to be accountability. And that certainly comes through in working with people in a therapeutic context in this pandemic.
Well, so we've been talking mostly about how the art therapy has evolved and changed and is reflecting things. To what extent has art therapy had an impact on things like social justice and Black identity, things like that?
So I think I can speak to that just from the work that I'm doing personally. I think the field has a long way to go, really, to make impacts on conversations around social justice. I think we're just beginning, but I do think in general the social services, the helping professions and social services have been a part of the problem, and really need to do some critical introspection on how we teach in our professions, who's a part of those professions, and really make some major changes. But I think in terms of the work that I've been doing in collaboration with several people in Chicago, working with an organization called A Long Walk Home, where we work with Black girls who are empowered to end gender-based violence. They're also deeply involved in racial justice work. And I have been working with Chicago activists who are bereaved by state violence, by police brutality, and the work that we are doing together is creating community spaces where people can share about their loved one, creating zines, creating performance spaces, and I do that work with students. This is a project called Care Sessions that I've been working on for the past few years. So it's a number of different projects, I think, that are hyper local and are really about collaboration and working closely with community organizers, youth, and trying to kind of co-construct what creative healing practice looks like.
Yeah, and so not only having an impact on the people that are participating, but also maybe in the community around them, right?
Absolutely.
Can you talk about one of these spaces that you're creating here? Give us an example of one.
Sure.
Some details.
Yes. So I worked with, again, the organization A Long Walk Home a few months ago to
That's a great name. I wasn't familiar with it. Is that just Chicago or?
It's a national organization,
Okay,
absolutely, yeah, and based in Chicago.
Okay.
And I worked with them as well as Justice for Families, which is a group of families who are bereaved by police violence, and also Black Lives Matter Chicago and the Chicago Torture Justice Center. They're people that we've been working with to do the care sessions. And so one of the care sessions with, I'm also a WAPB, Women's All Point Bulletin, and so one of the care sessions, what we did was invited youth to focus on a world that we could dream of freedom and safety for Black girls. So we worked with hair bonnets, so that's something that the girls would sleep in, and actually to embellish those bonnets while we worked together to really talk about and think through, what does that world look like if we were dreaming of the safety and freedom of Black girls.
What a great creative idea. That's wonderful. And so they produced these. And,
right, and shared those with each other.
They're sharing them. That's wonderful. We're almost to the end here, but I'm just curious. I mean, how did you get interested in this? What intrigued you most about it?
So I started out as an artist, and I was doing community work as well, and I learned about art therapy and realized that that was a way to bring both of those interests together. And so I wanted to find a way to use art not only for my own interests, right, but in a way that would allow me to engage in conversations and dialogue with others. So I found the profession of art therapy.
And so what preparation did you do to get involved in this then?
So I studied at the master's level and got a master's in art therapy, and my experience would be like anyone who would train for counseling, master's level training,
Sure.
where you go on and you get your license to practice and you get out there and start working.
Interesting. And you still work as an artist?
Sometimes. Right
Yeah.
now I'm doing a residency right now, and we are working on a project for missing and murdered Black girls. So we're doing altar installations as a way to create spaces for healing in the community, to really think about, again, how do we create a world where Black girls can be safe and free.
So, and when you talk about creating these spaces in the community, these aren't always you creating them. You're facilitating other people to do this as well.
Exactly,
I imagine,
a
right?
lot of collaboration.
Yeah. And then, but those people are going to practice the therapy are obviously people who have gone through the training and all of that, yeah.
Right, so, and so not all of the work in the profession of art therapy that art therapists do is in that traditional one-on-one therapy setting, exactly. So, a lot of the work I'm describing is in a community context that can be more like a peer support model, and also is really about therapeutic arts, therapeutic art making. That doesn't necessarily have to be facilitated by an art therapist. So there's kind of a spectrum in the ways that art therapists practice these ideas.
Is there a book or pamphlets or anything that people can get to if they want to just experiment with this themselves to study their own work?
There are absolutely a lot of works available for people to explore art therapy, and I think it just depends on what your interests might be. But I would certainly encourage folks to think about not only that individualized ways of thinking about change and transformation, but the one that looks at an integrated person in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could even look at snapshots you took without knowing you were creating a record and interpret those if you wanted. I know when we were talking before we went on, I mentioned that I have artwork back from when I was in high school, and I look at it and it reminds me of things I was thinking of then, and you said you were journaling, right?
Yeah, it could be a way of journaling.
That's a beautiful concept. So really all of the creative things that we've done throughout our lives, if we string them together, are kind of a journal that talk about what kinds of insights, especially our attitudes, our moods, our...
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think all of those things are true. You know, when we look back on the ways that we represent ourselves or, see ourselves.
Okay, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Leah Gipson for joining us today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. See you next time.